This is the second part of a two-part reaction. If you haven't seen it, the links to it are in the description and the top right corner of the video. With that out of the way, let's continue, shall we?
Wittmann continues down this road, leaving Sober behind, where he encounters 4 Cromwell tanks. Now, I don't care how good his crew claimed they were. It took the best Tiger crews about 6 seconds to reload each shell. 4 Cromwells firing back at him would have eviscerated Wittmann. But this is where I present a new argument. Wittmann is not the greatest tank commander who ever lived. He is the luckiest one. Out of all the Cromwells on that road, only 1 was actually capable of firing at him. 2 were OP Cromwells, having extra radio sets and built for artillery observation. 1 was unmanned. The only one capable of actually firing at Wittmann did not have his gunner on board. So when he saw this Tiger charging down the road towards him, he took the most obvious course of action and reversed into a garden. Wittmann would fail to spot him. This is Captain Pat Dias. He is going to become very important in just a little bit. Wittmann's luck is going to continue as he enters the town. He comes across a Sherman. Lucky for him, it's an OP Sherman with a dummy gun, and the only crew member on board is the driver. Wittmann misses the first shot, and the second goes through the turret and splits the dummy gun in half. The driver bails and claims he was shot at with MG fire. Wittmann drives on and comes across a second tank. This is the Cromwell of Paddy Victory, a man who would survive this encounter and go on to write about it. By striking luck, Paddy had been attempting to back his Cromwell up and had gotten it wedged onto a curbstone. It stretched out sideways across the street and can't move. He notices the Tiger bearing down on him and decides to bail. Again, Wittmann scores a kill without any return fire. Wittmann carries on and comes across another tank, another Firefly. Wittmann takes aim at the Firefly and misses. The Firefly does not. But in a startling moment of yet more good luck, Wittmann orders the tank to reverse, and the Tiger lurches backwards at the exact same time the Firefly opens fire. The shot places a gash down the side of the Tiger's turret. This will be important later.
Seriously? Oh my god, this sounds like bad RNG from World of Tanks!
Wittmann then reversed into a house. The rubble blocks the path of the Firefly, throws dust and smoke into the air, and he's able to turn around and drive back the way he came. At this point, he comes across another Cromwell. This is the one commanded by Dias, the one that reversed into the garden earlier. He's chased Wittmann into the town, and the two have now come face to face. And now finally, for the first time in this battle, an actual armored duel is about to take place.
Imagine that, you're gonna have tanks actually fighting each other that can fire back!
What transpires is pretty much what is written down. The Cromwell fires twice, cannot penetrate the Tiger's armor, the Tiger fires back, and Dias in his report describes the feeling of an 88mm shell passing between his legs. The crew bails. But there is something very wrong here. While every documentary and book that covers this duel will focus on Dias' frustration that his gun cannot penetrate the mighty armor of the Tiger, in reality, it actually can. The Brits have been fighting Tigers since 1943 over longer ranges with smaller guns. Of the 29 Tigers that were sent to North Africa, none of them would return. The 75mm gun on the Cromwell is marginally more powerful than the one on the Sherman. At a range of roughly 100 meters, a shot from the Cromwell would split the Tiger in half. So why doesn't it?
Was he pointing at them at an angle? Was that it?
If you take away anything from a Lazerpig video when I start bitching about tanks, then it should be that penetration tables you find on the internet are not worth the pixels they take up on your screen. Rough guides maybe, but as everyone should know by now, there are about 1,000 factors which can affect penetration. The quality of the steel, the angle of attack, the temperature, even the weather. So class, can anyone tell me what factor has affected this poor Cromwell? No one? Well, children, creepy Uncle Lazerpig shall tell you. Originally, I thought it might have been the range, and I had this whole rant planned out at this point where I thought if the tanks were maybe too close, there was a chance, just a chance, that the Tiger might have been inside the Cromwell's minimum range, and that the round was still too hot when it smacked against the Tiger's armor, which might have just been enough to blunt the penetrating tip, causing it to deflect rather than pen.
I've never even thought of that before. I've never thought of a tank gun having a minimum distance. Which, I mean, you're having something being fired out of a gun at hundreds of meters per second, being propelled by a small explosion. Yes, it would be hot. Heat makes material soft. I've never thought of that before. Okay, wow. Huh.
But given where Dias's chrome wheel was found, and where Wittmann's Tiger was positioned when it was finally taken down, they are at least 300 meters apart, well outside the chrome wheel's minimum range. And that last bit, that's actually quite significant. Where Dias's chrome wheel was found doesn't make any sense. In an interview he gave in the 1980s, Dias claimed he stalked Wittmann for about 5 minutes, hoping to get a chance at firing at the Tiger's rear. But the Cromwell is a fast tank. In fact, it's one of the fastest tanks in the Normandy theatre. For Dias to be in the position he was in when he got taken out, to give Wittmann the time to engage a Sherman, a Cromwell, drive into the centre of town, duel with the Firefly, turn around and start heading back out, Dias would have had to be driving at a pace slower than walking. Now here you understand what that rant about primary sources was all about earlier on, because Dias is a primary source, and Dias is wrong. John Cloudsley Thompson, the famous naturalist, was one of the other Cromwell commanders that day. He and his crew were fortunate enough to escape, but in 1956 he would admit that he witnessed Dias speed out of the garden that he was in and chase after Wittmann almost immediately after he passed him. Assuming Wittmann always fired on the move, Dias would have been able to catch up with Wittmann as he drove past Paddy Victory. Paddy Victory had ordered his driver to hard reverse into a shop window while the crew jumped out. Wittmann didn't notice this Cromwell until he was driving past it, at which point, according to Captain Victory, he paused, turned the turret, and fired at the Cromwell, hitting it just below the turret. Paddy then jumped back into the Cromwell and attempted to fire the gun into the rear of the Tiger, but he couldn't move the turret. So instead, he smashed up the tank's equipment best he could before leaving, just in case it was captured. While he was doing this, he didn't notice Dias drive straight past him, attempting to sneak up behind Wittmann, but Wittmann's turret was already pointed to his rear, and had the perfect shot on Dias as he rounded the corner. Dias didn't get a single shot off. Whether he is mistaken, misremembering, was encouraged by a documentary and sensationalist history book publisher to be a little bit, economical with the truth, or rah forbid, straight up lying, I don't know.
Economical with the truth, yeah. That's one way of putting it.
But his account has been retold by almost every single historian who has covered this event without question, including Taylor. Because in academia, questioning the account of a World War II veteran is akin to questioning the existence of God to a Christian. Nothing, of course, detracts from Dias's bravery in the situation. Had Wittmann noticed Paddy Victory's tank a little earlier, his turret would be facing the other way, and Dias would have ended him right there and then. But again, Wittmann is not the greatest tank commander, he is the luckiest. So Wittmann carries on. He gets to the outskirts of the town, and when passing a grocery store, he is hit in the side with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun. The tank is disabled, and he is forced to bail. He bails, and bravely runs away. Bravely ran away. The gun...
If that hadn't been in there, I was going to put that clip in this video.
Was actually part of the convoy he supposedly destroyed en route into town. The troops had abandoned their vehicles as Wittmann tried to machine gun them down, got themselves organised, equipped with anti-tank weapons, and had flooded into the village. The 6-pounder in the doorway was not a sudden stroke of luck for the Brits, it was a well-prepared ambush. Wittmann then fires off a load of machine gun rounds, and the Brits decide to keep their heads down, allowing him to escape. This is, of course, the common interpretation of events, and as you might expect, it's complete bullshit. The Firefly I mentioned earlier was commanded by Sergeant Stan Lockwood. The common interpretation is that the Firefly was positioned here when Wittmann spotted it. It was not. Lockwood was actually here, and according to him, Wittmann was all the way over here, pretty much 5 or 6 yards from where he shot Victory and Dias. He was not, contrary to what you might have heard, taken out by a 6-pounder gun hiding in a doorway. He never made it that far into the village. This image that is famously attributed to being Wittmann's Tiger is not. Lockwood's gunner sights had been configured incorrectly, and as a result, his shot hit the building next to Wittmann, which created a lot of smoke and debris. Wittmann turned around and bravely drove away. Bravely ran away. He was later taken out here to the junction by the 6-pounder gun that was positioned on the road just up ahead. Now this may be in contrast to what you probably have heard, because the getting taken out by a 6-pounder gun hiding the doorway in the centre of town is what Wittmann claimed happened in his radio broadcast. His Nazi propaganda radio broadcast. But because the British commanders did not initially know what was going on, they took this broadcast as factual. In fact, they took it so matter-of-factly, they didn't even bother to check if it was true or not. Out of all the officers that would survive Villers-Bocage, including the one who would escape Point 213, none were ever debriefed. Their knowledge and experiences never made it into the reports, so the British ended up simply parroting Nazi propaganda. And part of the reason all this went unnoticed was because it allowed one General Dempsey to use the failure at Villers-Bocage to politically undermine his rivals, leading to the oh-so-famous almost public scandal about the inferiority of British tanks in the eyes of the public that every documentary will suddenly cut to at this point, which in turn led to the great problem of tiger panic among the troops. Go Britain. But even now, decades later, this trend continues. While writing his book, Villers-Bocage Through the Lens, Taylor got the opportunity to speak with many of the veterans on the British side who were actually there, many of whom were so eager to speak on their experiences because no one had ever bothered to ask them about it. This should honestly give you an indication of the piss-poor level of research that many, in inverted commas, historians have actually done. If it had not been for Taylor, many of these men would have gone to their graves never having told their side of the story. Pat Dias, who was interviewed in the 80s, and then parts of that interview were broadcast on the Discovery Channel documentary Killer Tanks in 2004, remains the only person on the Allied side who was ever interviewed on camera. Dias would maintain that Wittmann had turned around by the time they came face to face, which cannot be true unless Dias sat around for several minutes doing nothing. Likely what happened was that, so many Tiger tank commanders, in order to compensate for their turret's slow traverse and get the gun onto targets faster, would order the entire tank to turn with the turret. So when Wittmann drove past Victory's Cromwell, he would have turned the entire tank, not just the turret, to get the gun on target faster. So when Dias came speeding around that corner, he would have seen Wittmann's Tiger now facing him, giving him the impression the Tiger had turned around and was now coming back the opposite way. But even if he was mistaken about the order in which events took place, that can hardly be his fault. He was being asked to talk about something that from his perspective happened over 40 years ago. He was an old man. He'd lived an entire life since then, and most likely he had forgotten a lot of the details. But what he did remember was that feeling of bitterness and inferiority that spread among the Allied forces thanks to the Nazi propaganda machine, the scandals in the sense that German tank designs were generations ahead of their own, which helped fuel the myths of the super advanced German war machines that have only recently started to finally be questioned. For many, Dias' shaky memory and Wittmann's radio broadcast, as well as the small amount of photographs that have made their way online, are the only sources people consult when writing their works on Villers-Bocage, which has allowed Wittmann to achieve an undeserved legendary status and an incorrect timeline to circulate throughout the common press, a timeline which people continue to argue about to this day.
Sorry, I had to pause there. Just... oh, that thought. I mean, these men, they have lived through something that I hope that I never have to. I mean, granted, with the way politics are going on right now, I'm starting to actually doubt that, but, you know, knock on wood, hope to God. But even then after that, just if everything you saw was just ignored and placed to like a secondary importance to literal propaganda from the enemy. Oh, that's really depressing.
There are now so many different versions of this timeline that it is now starting to rival Marvel. And even with all the work done by Taylor, which still goes largely ignored, people continue to argue about the Battle of Villers-Bocage to this day. How many tanks did the British lose? How many tanks were actually there? Which tank was Wittmann in? Is the Hewitt Godfrey a clothing store or a grocer? And that's my problem with this. This is all semantics. People have gotten so caught up in the finer details of the battle that the actual outcome of the battle is ignored. The outcome that Michael Wittmann, the famous hero of the Reich and argued as the greatest tank commander who ever lived, is the first recorded loss of a Tiger tank on the Western Front in a battle the Germans didn't even technically win. And the real fun stuff, what happened when Wittmann got out of the tank, is often forgotten. And that's where we pick things up. Now Wittmann is out of the tank, Where does he go? What does he do?
Run
He
away?
is the commander of the 101st. There are 5 Tigers and a Panzer IV sitting around not doing anything, but he has no radio to contact him. He could return to his group and order them to attack, but instead, he doesn't. Instead, Wittmann decides to walk back to the HQ of Panzer Lehr, on foot. That's a journey that will take him an hour and a half. And while he's doing this, Panzer Lehr start pushing towards Villers-Bocage, as do the 101st, now under the command of Mobius, as do the 2nd Panzer Army, which has been ordered to plug the gap. Because Wittmann has gone off alone, because he no longer has a radio, because he has not returned to his unit, absolutely no one on the German line knows what has just happened. As much as there is panic and confusion among the Brits, there is equal confusion among the Germans. They start to arrive piecemeal in Villers-Bocage and find the Brits there all now alert and prepared to fight tanks.
Oh.
The result was that when Wittmann's company, under the command of Mobius, arrived into the village, all 5 Tigers and 3 supporting Panzer IVs were destroyed. When the 2nd Panzer show up, though the Brits were falling back, they were still well prepared. 2nd Panzer, equipped with Panthers, suffered extremely heavy losses. By the following day, Panzer Lehr were ready to attack. By this point, the Brits had fully organised themselves into a defensive box. Lehr would attack them piecemeal, firstly almost getting wiped out by American artillery, and then finally getting pushed back by a British counterattack. When Wittmann returned to Villers-Bocage several days later to reclaim his tank, he did so completely uncontested. Each Tiger tank had been burned out. The British had covered them with petrol-soaked blankets and set them on fire. They were unrecoverable. He then made a speech about how brilliant he was and got interviewed by a German propaganda magazine who altered a few facts, doctored a few photographs, and attributed all British losses that day to him. As most of you should know by now, Michael Wittmann is not Germany's highest scoring tank ace. That title belongs to Kurt Nipsel, with 168 kills to his name, including one of the longest range tank-on-tank kills of the war at 3,000 meters. Nipsel also drove a Tiger, and would become distinguished in his service on the Eastern Front, taking part in some of the most grueling and largest tank battles in history, and eventually distinguished himself enough to be given command of a King Tiger. You'd expect a man of equal, if not greater distinction, to have been honoured in a similar way, but Nipsel only ever received one award: the Gold Cross. In spite of appearing in some of the same battles as Wittmann, he was never awarded in the same way. There are no great tales of his battles, no blow-by-blow accounts featured in books and documentaries. His Wikipedia article is barely a few paragraphs long. Now, why is this? The answer is because Wittmann was a Nazi. Now, I don't mean that as a slur. I mean he was actually a Nazi. He joined the Nazi party in the 1930s.
Oh, okay.
He was a member of the SS, the military arm of the party. He was also slim, good-looking, wore his hair back, and had a charming yet confidently dominating personality. Nipsel was not. He refused to shave, his hair was messy, he was apparently a bit of a practical joker, his uniform was often untidy, and he was highly critical of the Nazi party and how it operated. At one point, attacking an officer he saw mistreating prisoners.
So the reason why we don't know that much about him was because he wasn't the perfect poster boy. That makes sense now.
He was also in the regular army, not the SS. In short, Wittmann was the very model of a perfect Nazi, and while not a true Aryan with brown hair and green eyes, he was everything Goebbels and his propaganda ministry wanted. This image of the refined, honourable Bavarian gentleman whose skill and cunning alone was a product of the regime and something that was allowed to prosper under it, and whose loyalty to the regime was unquestioned, and who could be kept happy with symbols and tokens of prestige. This is why he was decorated so much. This is why whenever he saw a new tank he wanted, he got it. This is why when his friends and colleagues were freezing in the great winters in Russia, he was in a Bavarian spa receiving officer training. He was provided all the best equipment, all the best training, a smart-looking black uniform, and if he didn't look quite heroic enough in his photograph, it was retaken so he would be. And when he returned to Germany, he would tour factories for the cameras, meeting the workers, delivering speeches about how important their work was to the war effort, all while covering up the damage done by Allied bombings. He was even featured in a film about how the King Tiger would bring victory that was shown to the German public. That should tell you more about the man he was and the people who worship him and his legend. Because he wasn't innocent. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew those factories were barely operational. He could see the damage, and yet he had to lie to the cameras and claim that there was none. He could see the teams of slaves being forced to applaud him at gunpoint. He could see the Gestapo officers pretending to be factory infantry managers shaking his hand to pretend all was well, and he went along with it. He was not, as PanzerAce.net and many others have claimed, guilty of doing nothing but his duty, because he could have refused like Knipsel had. But that would have meant giving up his station. That would mean giving up his medals and his comfortable life, his comfortable apartment, his meetings with Hitler, and his face on all the newspapers and propaganda rags. He was a Nazi. He was an integral part of the propaganda machine, and he loved it. He accepted it, and he enjoyed the privileged trappings that it brought him. The same could not be said for Knipsel, Autocarius, or the 60 other German tankers who could also be attributed with the title of Panzer Ace, because outside of Wittmann, that term was never used. The term Panzer Ace, or Tank Ace, was never actually used by the Nazis, and awards or merits were never handed out based on individual kills, nor were individual kills ever really recorded in that way. Everything was recorded as a unit. The unit killed X number of tanks, not the individual, even if the unit only had one tank. This is why it has been so hard to determine if or not people like Knipsel and Carius actually achieved the kills attributed to them, but it has now become a very well established fact that the regular German here typically outperformed the SS. This was somewhat embarrassing, as the Germans, or more the Nazi propaganda machine, took every opportunity to promote the idea that the SS were superior. The SS was supposed to represent the very elite of the German fighting machine. The idea that the regular German army outperformed them was in contrast to this, so it became common to artificially create ace heroes by attributing the kills of the entire squad to one individual, or inflating kill scores by counting armoured cars and trucks and anti-tank guns as armoured kills. As the perfect icon of the proud, stern, brave and honourable gentleman tank commander, Wittmann was undoubtedly offered this privilege. We don't actually know what his kill count was. We probably never will with any reasonable degree of accuracy. But even if we did give him the benefit of the doubt and say that his unit made all those kills on the Eastern Front, then that doesn't exactly make him unique. You see, the T-34 kinda sucked. It was rushed
Yeah, we know this. You've made a video all about it.
to the front with very little training or preparation offered to the crews. In fact, during the first few months, many T-34s lacked an armor-piercing shell. The tank was awkward, slow, and was famously extremely difficult to see out of. The very early models were plagued with technical issues. Wittmann was in a Tiger, which in spite of that tank's overall failings, it did enjoy a superiority in range, firepower, and protection. Statistically, a Tiger commander could expect to obtain at least 30 to 40 kills before being killed themselves. Even the very worst or the very unlucky Tiger commander would typically expect to achieve an average of 7 kills. On the Eastern Front, Wittmann had 12 Tigers under his command, and with all of them attributing their kills to him, Wittmann was not some heroic legend, he was actually about average. If Villers-Bocage had not happened, it is doubtful anyone would know or care who Wittmann actually was, certainly not to the same degree we see him today. Because in reality, had Wittmann not attacked the British, the main vanguard would have arrived at a location they thought was safe, at the same time as Panzer Lehr, as well as the 2nd Panzer arriving from the south, came to back up Wittmann. They would have had fresh recon, which the British did not, and their counterattack would have had the element of surprise and potentially been devastating, trapping not just a small detachment, not just the vanguard, but the entire 7th Army in a pocket with no room to maneuver. Instead, when they did arrive, the Brits were dug in and well prepared, and with 6 Tigers down, their attack was somewhat blunted. The British didn't lose 27 tanks from Wittmann's attack, they lost 27 tanks in total. From an assault of 6 Tigers to a full-scale counterattack, 27 tanks was their total loss, and most of those were on point 213, where the British had burned their own tanks after realizing they were cut off and surrounded, leading to one of the British commanders at the time making a famous speech that someone better find his boots, because if he had to burn his tank, he wasn't going to walk to Berlin barefoot. But that commander made it back to British lines. In fact, almost everyone did, and all the vehicles that had been destroyed were repaired or replaced within 24 hours. Wittmann lost 6 Tigers at a time when there was only 36 operational across the entire front line, in an attack attack that ultimately achieved nothing, that would have gone better had he just sat on his hands. But it makes an excellent story, and that's all this really is. A story. A work of German propaganda that changed an embarrassing failure into a legend of cunning and wit, and proof that the Tiger was mighty and the Allied tanks weak. A tale retold by wereabouts again and again and again, with very little fact-checking ever taking place, unless it's to quickly read a book or a blog of another wereabouts to confirm that everything you believe is correct. It's another example, perhaps the greatest example, of a story where the factual accuracy has been lost to the convenience of the narrative, and where seemingly qualified historians have continued to propagate the work of Nazi propagandists because they think it sounds cool. It is the single greatest myth of the war ever made, and its champion was a pandered propaganda star who was average at best, whose single action when he was finally left to his own devices and didn't have anyone else holding his hand was to lose decisively at the cost of his entire unit. A huge amount of irreplaceable equipment. Wittmann was not a heroic tactical genius. He was not the greatest tank commander who ever lived, nor was he just an honourable man doing his duty. He was an arrogant, self-centred twat who shot at ambulances and fleeing tank crews, and who ordered his entire unit to remain behind while he charged blindly ahead, desperate to hoard all the glory for himself. It was luck, not skill, that got him that far into Villers-Bocage. Had Sabera not noticed and taken out that Firefly, it would have shot Wittmann in the back the second he blasted through that hedge. Had Dias had his gunner on board, he would have gotten a rare perfect shot directly into Wittmann's rear as he thundered past him. Had Paddy Victory been facing the right way, or had his turret not jammed, had Lockwood's gun sights been configured correctly, the story of Michael Wittmann would have ended as a footnote in history, told to young tank commanders about the perils of driving off alone without support. Because of his actions, the Germans in that region were now under strength. They'd lost the element of surprise, and Wittmann became the first,
and they lost all their heavy hitters.
The Western Front. While the wereabouts proudly proclaim he stopped a major Allied advance in its tracks, the Brits would retake Villers-Bocage the following month, and Caen itself shortly after. Wittmann's heroism, bravery, and masterful skill shown that day landed him a desk job far from the actual fighting. When he threw a temper tantrum, argued, bribed, and eventually threatened to go public about being shelved, he was given command of another Tiger group to command, of which he immediately attacked the British and Canadians head-on a clear day, over open ground, and was immediately killed. And that is the true legacy of Michael Wittmann, and in its own way the true legacy of fascism and the type of men it produces. They may look good from a distance, they may even act in a way that compels this idea of professionalism and gentlemanly conduct, they may even inspire the concept of greatness, but rather like those people who label themselves as alpha males and on the internet, when shit hits the fan and when it comes their time to shine and prove they are who they present to be, they're about as useful as the traffic lights in Grand Theft Auto.
Oh my god.
Actually, before we end, I have just one little thing to add. You see, there's this part of the battle that often goes ignored. I mean, outside of the stuff that I've discovered, of course.
Okay.
Some people who are more familiar with this battle may know that just before Wittmann hit those Cromwells, where Dias and the others were sitting around, there's these two Stuarts in the way. Now, some people think there's three Stuarts. That's because there's this third one that shows up later. It's a common mistake, don't worry about it. But these Stuarts, these are very, very light tanks, very lightly armed. They've got 37mm cannons. The Brits have had these things since the desert. They bought them from America. America uses them as well. They're pretty decent little recon tanks, but not really something you want to be in when, say, for example, a Tiger is driving down the road towards you. So the first Stuart makes the very sensible decision. They bail immediately. They just dive for cover. They're not taking any chances. But the other Stuart does not. This one is commanded by one Rex Ingram. He saw this Tiger hurtling down the street towards him, and rather than run, rather than bail, he took the damn thing head on. He fires machine guns at the driver's port, he fires smoke, he fires his main gun, all attempting to button this Tiger down, to blind it. He starts driving aggressively to try and slew it off the road, his massive titanium balls causing the tank to rock from side to side. It doesn't work. Wittmann puts a shot through the Stuart, and Rex and all his crew are unfortunately killed instantly. But it gave time for the others to realize what is happening, and many who were outside their tanks at the time, including the crew of a nearby scout car, dive for cover. The sound of Rex's tank exploding is what made Dias reverse into the garden long before he saw Wittmann. It made Paddy Victory try to get his tank to turn around. It gave Lockwood cause to realize that something was up, and allegedly made him duck back into the turret and load up an AP shell. Rex gave everyone just that little bit extra time. Had he not done what he had done, the death toll might have been just that little bit higher. And for years, his bravery has never really been fully recognized. His actions have been utterly overshadowed by this pathetic hero worship of his killer. He occupies the footnote that, honestly, Wittmann should be in. So if you're like me, and you have a drink in your hand, to Rex. Cheers.
Rex. The power of propaganda, everybody. Oh, I mean, at the very least, I can say, I hope that Michael Wittmann was killed by a Canadian. Oh, that would make me feel so happy. I mean, I love listening to this sort of stuff. Well, I mean, there's a reason I react to Lazerpig at all. I mean, I love history. It's the reason why I loved watching like Discovery Channel and National Geographic back in the day, and History Channel and all that. It's this stuff right here. You listen to it and it's just, you get a little bit of queasiness in your stomach. It just, oh, it's disgusting, isn't it? Oh yeah. Going to definitely be calling that for a video. So yeah, if you guys like that, original video is in the description. If you haven't seen it for some reason, corner video will be leading to my, let's play of the day if you want to check that out. And yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.